We met at again in the Senate, we met in Congress, we met at the Treasury Department, we did the first, I think, roundtable on this issue at the State Department, and basically we met with all these different kind of institutions and factors, so that way they could understand. What we were basically explaining to them is that upcoming regulations regarding cryptocurrency, the crypto assets, are extremely detrimental to human rights defenders. The regulation that, for example, Senator Warren is proposing in the US basically makes Bitcoin users and criminals almost synonyms. Basically, criminalize everybody who uses Bitcoin and everybody who is in the Bitcoin community. This is for us something extremely, extremely dangerous, because basically will destroy all human rights activists. I was explaining to these people how we, in African countries, Middle East and Latin America, how we need to use Bitcoin, because otherwise we will not be able to operate, and how Bitcoin for us is, again, is a tool for human rights.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Today we are here with the one and only Jorge Jraissati. That was okay pronunciation. I'm going to give myself maybe a 50% on that, but I'll let Jorge pronounce his last name for you in just a moment. He is the Director of Alumni for Liberty, which is a division of Students for Liberty, which has over 10,000 members from 139 countries. Jorge is also a researcher, the IESE Business School. He's a university lecturer, and he's contributed to publications such as Foreign Policy and the National Review. An extremely accomplished person, I think only 27 years old. Met Jorge in person for the first time about a week and a half ago down in Washington, D.C. at an event that was sponsored by Students for Liberty. Really fun fact, we did not know each other then, but while I lived in Venezuela, we actually lived down the street from one another, not just metaphorically down the street, but literally down the street from one another. And Jorge studied English at one of the schools at which I taught English in Venezuela. Again, I did not teach him or anything, and our paths did not cross there, but it kind of felt very serendipitous that he and Ludmila Kozlovska, who's been a previous guest on this podcast, invited me down to this event that we got to meet. And we've been doing a little bit of work together that we'll get into as we have this discussion here. But Jorge, let me hand the mic over to you. Please let the audience know what I might have missed in terms of introducing yourself. And yeah, just let us know a little bit about yourself.
No, amazing introduction. I think the most interesting thing is that we were actually living in the same city, and like really, as you mentioned, close to each other. And they were teaching at the school that I spent a couple of summers trying to improve my English when I was younger. And now, basically, you mentioned very well what we're doing. I'm the Director of Alumni for Liberty. We have 10,000 members in over 100 countries, 139, as you mentioned. And what we try to do is that we're trying to form an international coalition of freedom activists, people who want to advance the ideas of freedom, open society, free markets, rule of law, transparent and democratic processes. And we want to also build and bring people together from different spaces. Like we want to have people to do it through academia, others who do it through policy, others who do it through politics, others who do it through journalism, and basically come together and form this coalition. Because right now, what we see is that the authoritarian regimes, the populists, the socialists, they are forming their own coalition. They work together. They work together to undermine democracy in their countries and undermine democracy in the West. So in order to win, I think this new geopolitical paradigm, we also need to work together.
That's amazing. And I'm also kind of curious. So how do a lot of people who have joined Students for Liberty find it? How have a lot of, these 10,000 members, how do they come to Students for Liberty?
I mean, I think most of people who join these kind of organizations is because they found a curiosity. I think they found intellectual curiosity and also a vocation to make some change in society. So basically, most people who joined because they found this. They found us on campus. Maybe they found a member. Maybe they went to one of our events. Maybe they saw us on media and on social media, and they can apply. And we provide intense training programs. The Students for Liberty, we want to train people on practical things, like professional things, and at the same time, intellectual stuff. We teach people a set of principles that we think bring prosperity to our society.
Yeah.
I believe that the principles of free market, rule of law, the principles of tolerance, the principle of freedom of speech. I think these ideas are the ideas that bring freedom and they bring progress to our societies.
Yeah.
No society has ever developed under socialist ideas. No society has ever developed under the ideas of communism or under their far-right ideas. No, societies develop when people are free to pursue their dream, free to build any project they want, and actually free to build the life that they want, the pursuit of happiness, as the Americans call it. And these are the ideas that I also want to bring to countries like Venezuela.
Yeah.
In my country, we have everything to be a successful country. We have natural resource. We have a young, thriving population, very entrepreneurial population, as I'm sure you noticed when you were there.
Yep.
And these people, they just need institutions to make it happen.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point there, and also describing, you said socialist and far right, and the way when I sort of talk about certain ideals that you talk about via Students for Liberty and Alumni for Liberty, I often talk about it's not so much thinking about it in terms of socialist or not socialist, it's more centralization of power, right? So is it just one person who's making decisions for the whole populace, what they can and can't do? I think that's sort of what promoting freedom, human liberty, more opportunity for people to make decisions to better their own life. I think that's a really tremendous privilege that a lot of us have. Some of us in Western countries like the States, in some ways, we're sort of losing those privileges, and we're learning that we have to fight for them if we want to maintain them. But you know firsthand what it was like living in Venezuela. You're Venezuelan. I didn't mention that when I started, and you lived under both the Chávez and the Maduro regimes, and you were an activist during those times. Could you tell us a little bit about what Venezuela was like during those times, and then why you had to leave the country?
Yes, I mean, basically Venezuela, whenever we hear over the news about the humanitarian crisis, whenever we hear over the news about the state of authoritarianism, it's even worse.
Yep.
In Venezuela, I remember the reason I joined all this movement, the reason I became doing everything that I'm doing, is because I remember being 15 years old or 16 years old and just seeing the level of intolerable levels of poverty and of misery that we have, and the amount of social inequality, economic inequality. And I remember just thinking, how can a supposedly rich country, oil-rich country, can actually have over 70 or 80% of the population in poverty.
Yep.
Right now, today in Venezuela, 70% of people are in extreme poverty.
Right.
These are people that cannot have enough money to eat. These are people that all of them have to work. Their family members who are living maybe in other countries need to send them money. And not even with that, these people can actually survive. So basically, this is why I took the decision to dedicate my life to this mission, to bring freedom to my country. And basically, I started doing activism. I was a young person, so I was doing activism. I was visiting difficult neighborhoods. I was doing social kind of work. And this was my way to contribute. And then I had to leave the country because there was massive protests in 2014.
Yep.
Many young people were arrested. And basically I said, no, I better go to study. I went to study in the US. And my idea was to study and come back, which I actually did, in fact, against all odds. But basically I went to the States. In the States, I realized that my way to contribute, to keep contributing, was becoming a bridge between what was happening in Venezuela and the international community. So I started reaching out to think tanks. I started reaching out to NGOs. I started writing in media, going to give speeches at university, and basically explaining also young people two things: why they needed to support the Venezuelan cause for freedom. I went to many universities, I give a speech at many universities. And I also then wanted to explain to them what things we did wrong in Venezuela, so we did not have another Venezuela. Because we also need to prevent these things from happening. Prevention is way easier than then trying to bring back a country after a total collapse. So basically try to explain them what were the reasons that Venezuela become a mess, what were the specific policies that led Venezuela to become a socialist and authoritarian mess.
Yep.
So that way we can also protect our free societies from these bad ideas that literally cost the life of millions of people, that cause hunger, everybody who lived under the Soviet Union, everybody who lived under Mao in China, everybody who now lives in Venezuela, they will tell you these ideas matter. And they matter because they destroy life. And just to give you a quick statistics, for example, in Venezuela, we have around 28 million people. 7 million people have left the country.
Yeah, right.
This means that every family is broken, including mine. All our families, we cannot see our parents, we cannot see our friends. My friends are all over the place. And these are people who their life had been utterly destroyed. Because somebody who was an engineer in Venezuela, now they need to start a new life in Chile, where, for example, they need to do whatever to survive. So that's the situation. I moved to the States, then actually came back to Venezuela. I came back in late 2019 because that's what I wanted. I wanted to understand the reality of the situation, not just I was hearing about it.
Yep.
I found that was even worse. And basically, I stayed over a year doing research on the policies and doing research also on the effect of sanctions and how sanctions were not working the way they're intended to.
Yeah, I appreciate that overview. While I spent time there, I learned a lot about the early days of Chávez coming to power and how he brought in, I think he had the misiones, he was bringing in doctors from Cuba, and he made higher education more affordable. So generally speaking, do you feel like when someone sort of takes power, authoritarian leader, socialist leader, do you think it's sort of the allure of what they're offering and then kind of saying, I'm the only one that can provide this to you? Why do you think Venezuelans invited someone like Chávez in, and Chávez has now segued to Maduro? And then I'll just ask both questions now. That, and then also I was speaking with someone else from Venezuela on this podcast, and he said, you just made a point to say that prevention is much easier than trying to take power back once you've lost it. Do you see a peaceful way in which a democratic rule of law or democratic system can be reinstated in Venezuela, or I don't even want to use the term, but is it not going to be pretty to try to reestablish that?
Okay, so the second question is about if I know that if I see a peaceful transition to Venezuela.
If there's a possible peaceful transition. Yeah. First question was just, what is it about? What do leaders like Chávez, what were they offering at that time back in the late 1990s, I think it was, when he came to power? Yeah.
Look, in like the common response from Venezuelans and Venezuelan elites, for example, they tend to disregard, or they tend to not think enough why Chávez actually became a thing. So that's why your question is so important, because the first thing that we need to analyze is why, when people, and this is in general, we need to analyze in countries why certain politicians are being supported.
Yep.
This is like the first, why do people are believing in populists? Why do people, for example, after the Great Recession, why did some socialist movement begin to arise in Europe? Yep. Or why certain people, again, after the 1990s, why all Latin America became socialist?
Yep.
So why Chávez became successful in his political agenda, why Chávez was elected, and the reason is that there was a big dissatisfaction with the way the economy was actually including people. This is what I believe.
Yep.
I believe that if you have a country in which repeatedly people hear that we are rich, that we're oil rich, that we are developing all these things, if you repeatedly hear this, but then you go into your house and you enter and you open the refrigerator, and you don't see enough food.
Yep.
And then you go and you see that your son doesn't have good job prospects. And this was the case of Venezuela in the 1990s.
Yep.
There was crisis for several reasons. Bad policy, bad leadership, but also external factors. Oil, for example, the price of oil. In fact, the price of oil when Chávez was elected was at its lowest point at the time. So there is even a symbolism there.
Yep.
But because of all these reasons, then people try to find solutions. And they always try to find solutions outside the mainstream, because the logic, if the mainstream are the one causing my situation, my life not be correct, then I need to find an external solution.
Yes.
Usually in the Latin American tradition, these external solutions come from very radically socialist kind of ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even anti-corruption ideas, which was the one that actually Chávez was running for in 1998. So people, when they see the situation of massive economic exclusion, they, again, voted for Chávez. Chávez became powerful. Chavez then enjoyed the largest boom, oil boom in the history of Venezuela. We received around, I think, a bit less than $1 trillion on oil revenues.
Okay.
He also, and for a country of the size of Venezuela and how poor we are, this is like a massive influx of money. And he also, for example, put Venezuela $200,000 million in debt. We run fiscal deficits of around 20% of GDP every year.
Wow.
So he did all these things with one purpose, which was to create a clientelar system which allowed him to stay in power. So he developed all this rent-seeking clientelar system, which people often associate with votes, but this also happens at the high level, elite kind of level. So he created a rent-seeking oligarchy that then is extremely dependent on the state. And basically, that's the way to install a dictatorship. The way these dictatorships are installed is that they start using all their machinery, all their power to create people who are extremely dependent on them, elites. There is an interview that, for example, I remember watching, I think over 10 years ago, an interview between Anthony Bourdain and the former Russian opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov. And basically, something that Nemtsov said that it was stuck on my mind since then. Now, by when Boris Nemtsov killed in Russia, then he said, "Look, corruption exists in every country. Every country has corruption. The thing in Russia is that the corruption is the system. That's like the nature, the institution. Like that's the way everything is built around. So corruption exists in every country, but in authoritarian countries, is basically the glue that keeps the system together.
Yeah."
So that's why then Chavez became so powerful, Maduro became more powerful. All institutions were basically colonized. And then, coming to your second question, do I see a peaceful transition from this? I do.
Good.
I think if not, I will not be doing anything I do and will be working on something else. But I do. At the same time, I'm not a naive idealist kind of person. I know, which I think... There are two people that I think make a ton of harm to our causes. One of them is the eternal pessimist, the people who see that nothing can be done, and the people who basically discourage anybody who thinks about a better future. Those people, they don't have a space, you know. The other people that I think they do harm in a more well-intentioned manner are those who are naive idealists, in the sense that they think that in order to make change, we can keep doing things again and again the way that we have been doing them. And we need to admit that in the last 20 years, all pro-democracy opposition movements, we had failed. The world is much more undemocratic, authoritarian, populist today than 20 years ago. We need to analyze then what is going on that in all our societies are becoming more authoritarian and democracies are becoming less democratic. So we need to then analyze what are we doing wrong, and we need to completely reshape the way, for example, institutions like institutions that promote democracy, the way they do it. And this is also why you and I were talking about these financial also tools that we can start using. We need to use more Bitcoin. We need to start using this type of new technologies like the blockchain. And not only that, but that's just something that I know you and I are very passionate about. So that we can actually make changes. And we also need to understand the power of giving, I think, financial inclusion and financial power to people. But I'm very optimistic that Venezuela will. And the only solution that we have is a peaceful solution. That's something that I do believe in. I do believe that we need to have a peaceful solution, because the people who are bringing violence is not us. The people who are bringing violence is the regimes, it's autocratic regimes. But we need to be smart about it.
That's very inspiring, and I agree that that's the right way to look at it and to go about things. One of the main tenets of classic liberalism, and when I say liberalism, for everyone listening, I'm not talking about liberal as it's associated with like the left or the center left, just the general sort of liberal, laissez-faire, free market system, is cooperation, is peace and cooperation, not coercion and violence. So when it comes to something like this, though, I think, so I wanted to go back to a situation I was in where people were talking about socialism being the only answer and, you know, advocating for more authoritarian forms of government. I was in social work school, and whenever I would bring up concepts associated with classical liberalism, how they could potentially help, most of the people in the room were like, we don't want to ever hear your voice again. Like, how dare you say this word? I mean, God forbid if you said something like capitalism or something like that, which isn't even my favorite word. I prefer to use the term free markets. Capitalism, I think, just has this negative connotation. But what I think people miss is this idea that it's inherently disempowering to not allow people to make their own decisions. But at the same time, people are so sort of, if you're from, a lot of people in that room with me were from maybe Haiti, different parts of Latin America, this and that. And so there weren't a lot of really good paying jobs in their country. They felt like they were taken advantage of by maybe American corporations who were paying very low wages in these countries. What would you say to a room full of people like that who I think have very real grievances, but don't necessarily know the bargain they're making by saying, well, we just want some authoritarian leader to take over and make everything better?
I mean, there is, and you are right, by the way. You are right in the sense that many people were well-intentioned, who, for example, work on social work, as you mentioned. They see income redistribution, they see wealth redistribution as the way to bring a better life to the people that they care about. Same happens with, for example, in Latin America, where the predominant or the paradigmatic economic ideas are mostly socialist ideas. Even from left-wing social democracy right to communism. Finding a pro-free market people tends to be more difficult in Latin America because of our history, because of many reasons. Something that the way I try to explain this, first of all, what is the target? What do we need to actually say? We need to say is that our ideas actually are the ideas who benefit the poorest people the most, the people who are economically excluded. So we need to, I think, begin by explaining to them that this is like our intention. Like if we are defending free market, rule of law, open trade, if we are defending financial inclusion, we are doing all these things because we believe this is best for the people who are in most dangerous and difficult situations. So that way we also establish what is our intention. Because usually socialists tend to have, in my countries, for example, they tend to have the monopoly of the good intentions.
And I just want to say that's a perfect phrase, a monopoly of good intention. That's an amazing phrase. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. And basically, then what happens is that the people who defend markets, free market, for example, they tend to then speak on a more colder way, which is speak on behalf of economic efficiency, on behalf of balancing budgets, on behalf of these things, which are so inhuman, like they're so cold by itself. So then they're starting from I always make the example. When you have a debate, you have the socialist person talking about social reivindication, you're talking about poverty, all these things, and you have the person on the right talking about balancing the budget. Like, what's going to be more convincing?
Right, that's right, yeah.
That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think the way, for example, particularly the way I see markets is a bit different also than the way it's traditionally explained. What I tend to say to people, and for example, I gave this lecture last week in Florida, and I try to emphasize this, is that the people who, for example, are really concerned about the issue of inequality, they should think about the inequality in a different way. Many people think about inequality from a consumption perspective, income inequality. But I think the real inequality is the inequality of production capacity, of economic inclusion. Like the way I see it, that's the root cause of the issue. Why there's so much income inequality? Because there are some people who can be productive and there are others who cannot be productive.
Interesting.
This happens in several ways. One of the ways that, for example, we have mentioned is that in Latin America, the vast majority of people do not have access to market institutions. By market institutions, I mean they don't have access to banking. They don't have property rights. They don't have collective security. So just to give you an example, if you are somebody from Venezuela or from any Latin American country, most probability is you are not within the formal legal kind of structure of a job creation process. So basically you are paid in cash because you also don't have a bank account. You are then carrying your cash 1 or 2 times per month, and the criminals know that you are carrying cash. They will take away your cash. You're taking a bus. That, by the way, a bus in Venezuela, public transportation, it takes you 3-4 times what it should take. So, for example, somebody in Venezuela to go to work, usually they have to spend 4 hours per day on public transportation, where
Wow.
they could be spending 1 hour. These are 3 hours that people are losing in terms of productivity or leisure. Just if we say that let's say that they apply these 3 hours to productivity kind of
Yeah.
activity, we are literally talking that their working day can be increased by 20-30%, or you can put the number. This means that really their productive capacity is being decreased by 30% or something like that. Just to tell you about the type of calculation that we economists make when we see this issue.
Yeah.
So we need to provide all these market institutions to people, bottom up in a way, because that's the only way to bring actual wealth. That's the way to bring productivity to people, which
Yep.
brings them economic opportunities. And that's the only way that I think, and it's a win-win situation also. Redistribution of income is redistribution. It's a zero-sum game. But putting resources together to make people productive is a win-win situation.
Yeah.
Win for the individual and win for society in the long run. In this way, we are not condemning people to charity, basically. We are creating self-reliant members of
Yes.
society. And at the same time, what we are doing, again, is just finding ways that everybody can have access to become productive instead of focusing on redistributing just the bit of wealth that our
Yep.
country have. So I think that when I explain this in this way, and of course it's different by different audiences, you have, of course, an audience who is very into economics and these things. And of course it's different for every person. But I think it's just coming from empathy, just coming from telling that our intentions are the same intentions that they have, and it's to explain to them that our ideas are the ones who have produced wealth in every part of the world. There has never been a country that by income redistribution has become from poor to rich. It never happened.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the way I will tackle the issue. It's not easy because it's like ideas, type of changing the ideas in mind of people.
There's 2 or 3 things that come to mind as you said that. One, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but there is a gentleman named Valentin Popescu who is in Peru right now, working with an NGO called Motive. It's Motive Peru, and he's working in the Andes with. I think Peru is has one of the most unbanked populations in the world. I'm going to say 57% of the country does not have access to a bank or any sort of financial services. And this guy Valentin has a heart of gold. I met him in Salvador at Adopting Bitcoin, and had him on the podcast, and he brings me to tears every time I talk to him because he cares deeply about the people with whom he works. He's actually Romanian, but married a Peruvian woman. Now he's doing this sort of work in Peru. And what he's doing is he's in villages where people don't have financial services. As a result, another thing that doesn't often get discussed by the left is just the quality of money that people are working with. So even if you're redistributing money, if you're redistributing money that's constantly inflating, it still provides some sense of hopelessness to people because they're not able to really invest in anything, especially if they're only using cash. So he started in 2020, someone explained Bitcoin to him while he was doing his NGO work, and he started essentially banking the unbanked in the Andes and in 15 different regions of Peru. And I think that some people hear about Bitcoin Beach or Bitcoin Nikasi, some of the bigger circular economies. I think what Valentin is doing in Peru is the ultimate model for this, because he's not only just giving people access to this financial technology, he's bringing people back to life. It's becoming a catalyst. People are stopping drinking. They're starting to feel that they have stake in something, that they have a piece of something. We got cut off there a little bit, everybody. I'm just going to dive back in. What I was saying, though, we have this organization in Peru doing work, not only just bringing Bitcoin to people but actually teaching people certain entrepreneurial skills and then allowing them to save in something like Bitcoin, transact in something like Bitcoin. And I've heard this story from many people around the world about how it's bringing people back to life. I've heard it similar with Black people in townships in South Africa, in places where apartheid had really sort of not only beaten them down economically on an education level, but beat them up, took their soul away, really, really made them feel like less. And I'm seeing it revive people. And the third thing I was thinking of was also just my experience as a teacher. A lot of people will come to you with a story of like, I can't do this, or I'm not capable of this, or blah, blah, blah. But if you actually sit there and push them at the appropriate level, don't push them too much because that can also scare them away, but say like, I think you can, and try to find that in with people, you will see them light up when you try to actually empower them to have them do something on their own and then see them accomplish something. You will sort of light up. If I sort of abided by the story, if I sort of said like, you know what, you're right, you're the way you are because of maybe the history of what's happened to people of your heritage or something like that, and if I just keep feeding into that story, there might be some truth to it for sure, but it's not going to necessarily help somebody move forward. And this stuff has to be done, I think the way you said it, it was really important. It has to be done with empathy. It has to be done tastefully. You can't just force it down people and say, no, you're better than that. Come on, blah, blah, blah. You have to find that right way of approaching whoever you're speaking with, meeting them where they're at, believing in them. And I think that it's a very similar thing with the economy. It's getting people involved so that they can do something on their own, because the opposite is inherently disempowering. If somebody can't do it on their own and they're constantly relying on an external system to do it for them, they're not really moving forward in life in really important ways. So I think getting into the mentality, believing people can change, believing they can become productive members of society, not that in and of itself, just believing it is the cure-all, that's just the first step. Then it's figuring out ways to connect them to the right resources to help them out where possible. And I know just from some of the people I've spoken with that even just the Students for Liberty Network does that for a lot of people. And it was really inspiring to see. I think at the event, I was out a week and a half ago with Jorge. I think there were people from, it was either 40 or 60 countries there. And extremely international. Yeah, it was super inspiring to see people from all over the world speaking with each other, networking, and sharing these values. I think it's really important. I want to rewind a little bit before the the event last week, 2 weekends ago. You spent the week before that in Washington speaking with policymakers, senators, I think congresspeople. I know senators, about the importance of Bitcoin as a tool for activists around the world, especially activists living under authoritarian regimes. And you said something really, you and Ludmila said something amazing to me. And, you both described to me like, look, politicians will listen. The government is not a monolith. People can change if you sit and talk to people. And sometimes I tend to be too cynical. I don't think like this enough. And it was very refreshing having that conversation with you. So I was hoping you might be able to share some of your experience in speaking with politicians, both about issues related to Bitcoin like you did 2 weeks ago, but just generally speaking to power, how to get through to them, and what changes you've seen in them.
Yes, exactly. First of all, exactly. We cannot be too cynical sometimes, in the sense that I also have by the way, your tendency.
Yeah.
To think this way, right? Because we come from difficult places.
Yep.
But at the same time, politicians are people.
Yep.
Politicians have ideas in their head. They have interests in their head. They have calculations, of course, about their political agenda. The good position that we have also is said that we are not doing partisan politics in any way, shape, or form.
Yep.
What we're doing is promoting human rights. We are above partisan lines. So that's something that also position ourselves in ways that we can talk to them and we can also be frank with them. As you mentioned, the work that we have been doing, we had over 20 meetings in 4 days. I think we ended up having 25 meetings in 4 days. Wow. About the importance of Bitcoin as a source of human rights, as a tool for human rights, for freedom, and also explaining to all these institutions why there were a series of financial and banking regulations known as anti-money laundering regulations that were basically depriving millions of people from their human rights and their economic rights, particularly to communities where we focus on activists being deprived of financial services and immigrants being deprived of financial services. We met again in the Senate, we met in Congress, we met at the Treasury Department, we did the first, I think, roundtable on this issue at the State Department. And basically we met with all these different kind of institutions and factors so that way they could understand. What we were basically explaining to them is that upcoming regulations regarding cryptocurrency, the crypto assets, are extremely detrimental to human rights defenders. The regulation that, for example, Senator Warren is proposing in the U.S. basically makes Bitcoin users and criminals almost synonyms.
Yep.
Basically, criminalize everybody who uses Bitcoin and everybody who is in the Bitcoin community. This is for us something extremely, extremely dangerous because basically will destroy all human rights activists. I was explaining to these people how we, in countries, in African countries, Middle East, and Latin America, how we need to use Bitcoin because otherwise we will not be able to operate. And how Bitcoin for us is again is a tool for human rights.
Mm-hmm.
So we were explaining this to these legislators and policymakers. I was also explaining to them how all these laws called anti-money laundering regulations have to be reformed, particularly because they're being directly or indirectly used to take away the financial rights of millions of people. In the case of activists, on purpose by authoritarian regimes, and in the case of immigrants, indirectly. Just to give you an example, let's say that you are an immigrant coming from Venezuela. Banks are highly incentivized to not take you as a client because you have a very high risk profile because you're coming from a country with a high probability of money laundering activities.
Yep.
So laws that are well-intentioned end up really become detrimental to millions of people because the people who are actually doing money laundering, they know how to get bank accounts because they have lawyers that know how to do these things. And then the regular people, the people who are working to these new countries, they're basically escaping to these new countries actually because of the actions of actual real criminals, political criminals, and day-to-day criminals. They are being now deprived to become productive members of society. People that, if you don't have financial inclusion, you don't have economic inclusion. If you don't have economic inclusion, you don't have social inclusion. And you basically are always condemned to informal economy, potentially criminal activities, and you are never a full member of your new society.
Yep.
So basically, we met with all these people, we met with all these institutions because we are proposing a specific policy reforms that put human rights at the center of financial reform.
Yep.
We believe that the way financial regulations are done institutionally, they have to change because right now they have a bias towards these issues, particularly the fact that civil society is never involved on the creation or the design or financial regulations. And the problem is that then all these unintended consequences are becoming bigger and bigger. And what this can result is in basically banking changing fundamentally the way we see it. So banking will stop being a system that hedges or monitors or basically brings together potential creditors or investors to investment opportunities. It will stop being this and will become like a second type of police. So this will fundamentally damage our free market system and our economic systems all over the world. We already have done much more of this work in Europe. So we already, because I'm based in Europe, for example, so we have done way more of this work in Europe. With Ludmila, for example, we had met with the former president of the Financial Action Task Force, which is basically the G7 institution that creates all financial regulations at the G7 level. We had met with people at the European Parliament. We have also delivered testimonies at the German Parliament, and we made submission to several institutions. And for example, last week we made a submission to the Treasury Department on this issue. Myself, particularly, I also wrote a specific policy recommendation on the issue of immigrants in Europe. And my policy recommendation actually is now being supported by over 20 members of parliament in Europe. So basically, right now, this proposal is a formal motion for resolution in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Basically, what it says is that we need to review AML regulations, anti-money laundering regulations, to guarantee that immigrants are not being deprived of the right to financial services. So basically, what we want is to put this together on the agenda, so that way all the member states of the Council of Europe, which are over 40 member states, then they have to then, at the local level, domestic level, implement this reform, which I believe is essential for economic growth, which I believe is essential for political stability, and I believe is also a human right for all people. And again, this issue of harmful financial overregulation is something that can destroy the way we think and we feel free societies.
Yeah, I think your voice is particularly important coming from a place like Venezuela, now living in Europe. Um, Obviously, the voice of Ludmila, who's been debanked, who's had her bank accounts frozen, shut down, people who have actually gone through this. It's really important, especially when speaking with policymakers and regulators who are based in Western Europe or the United States, where where having sort of financial rails and financial services work for you is the same as sort of like breathing oxygen. These things are just, you're sort of swimming in it. It's just a normal part of life that you don't think about that much, and you definitely don't think about how these things could be weaponized against you by even if your intentions are good, you need to hear voices of people who come from different scenarios, who can explain to you this is who you're putting in danger by doing this. The work that you're doing, having sat in on some of these meetings with you, it's incredibly important work. It's as steeped in this world as I am, it's still eye-opening for me to continue to hear from people who don't have access to these services. And I think I've been talking about it a lot since coming back from this, from the conference a week and a half ago. It's almost like for me, it's like a recalibration of not only cognitively how I think about Bitcoin, financial services, policy, all these things, but almost emotionally, because when you hear from people, and when you see people who benefit from this, and you hear the stories of people who really need this as a lifeline, it becomes a totally different thing. And to know that the majority of people I speak with, when I talk to them about Bitcoin, they just think I'm talking about nothing other than a speculative asset. And I get that. Unless you hear some of the stories that you're talking about, people would just say, well, why don't you just invest in the S&P 500 or this or that, not really understanding the full nature of Bitcoin as a permissionless way to transfer value, both a network and an asset. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done, but I think I'm optimistic because based on what I've seen, the work that you're doing, plus what I've heard from others, people's minds can change. And I think there's what I admire about your approach in particular is that there's a really heavy emphasis on humanity, on appealing to people's humanity. Like, look, you might not get this. You don't call people stupid for not getting it. You don't get frustrated. You just explain to them, here's another perspective. Please try to understand this and incorporate it into your policy. With that said, what are some big victories you've seen? What sort of, we all sort of need little victories along the way to keep us going. So what have been some of those that have kept you going?
I mean, the victories, there are several victories that I think have allowed me to keep going in all regards in Venezuela and in these issues. Is that, first of all, my experience has been that if you approach life and you approach activism in this way, as you mentioned, not calling anybody stupid for not getting an issue. Because I mean, we know about things that we know also because we have had experiences. We have had ability to have education.
Yes.
We have had so having always this level of, I think, being humble enough to understand things. The same way that, for example, I'm sure if somebody who works on chemistry wants to explain me something, they need to be extremely patient.
Yes.
Somebody's working on, or in even other policies, like environmental policies or stuff like this. Like, they need to be super patient. I am very patient when I'm explaining the things that I'm all day researching or all day talking about. So it's small victories, like as the one I told you, we have had two or three policy victories already. Motion for resolutions are official documents.
Cool.
And I got it on this immigration thing. I also make a proposal about having more youth participation on policy decisions, particularly on economic decisions. Because I believe that, for example, many of the economic issues that we have is because we have economic policies who are biased towards older people. If most Congress people are closer to 70 years old, and only, I think, 3% of parliamentarians internationally have less than 35 years old or under 40 or something like this.
Wow.
So that's why I think you have a ton of institutional biases towards policies that have more debt, public debt, less economic opportunities, less entrepreneurial dynamisms, all these things. So I make this whole argument, and I also try to find ways to have more transparent ways that young people can be involved in policy decisions. And in this case, I also have members of parliament supporting this. So that was also something that I was able to do this year. I went to the European Parliament, and there was a ton of reception for this issue from, again, all political parties, basically, because I have this broad approach.
Yep.
I, of course, will never have anything in common, I think, with a communist or with a far-right authoritarian.
Yeah.
But anything that can become, that if somebody believes in an open society in one way or another, I think there are ways that we can have things that we have in common.
Yeah.
So these kind of victories, at the same time, the fact that we see institutions that are supporting us, and at the same time, what I have felt is that there is communities that want to support us. For example, in the Bitcoin community, I was, as you know, I have talked to people, from people who use Bitcoin for human rights purposes to
Yeah.
miners, for example. I told you that I met miners last weekend in this event in Miami that we assisted. I remember their name was Marty and Thomas.
Yep.
Correct. So basically, both of them were telling me about the great things they're doing, and I was telling them about what I'm doing, and they showed that they were optimistic and excited.
Yeah.
So this is what the small victories that I also good for me, like to find people that believe in the things that we believe, that we support each other
Yeah.
from different ways. And I think that's something that I want to keep doing. We met last week, and now we have ideas about the future.
Yep.
So you met Rafa also from Guatemala, who is using Bitcoin blockchain technology to safeguard election results.
Yep.
Which is something that, of course, has been Venezuelan, is something that is brilliant.
Yep.
So basically, these are like the things that we need to build a team. I think we need to be the spaces of cooperation. Like
Yep.
I imagine, for example, us from a year from now, or even less, being able to have a big retreat in which we bring together high-level activists, we bring Bitcoin community, we bring miners, we bring policymakers, and we come together to basically discuss these issues and find proposals from these issues. So that's what keeps me going, and I'm very excited about the things that we can do.
Yeah, likewise. I think it's a great way to start wrapping it up. It's the vibe at LibertyCon, this event we were at a week and a half ago, was very similar to the feeling when I was in Salvador 2 months before that, and Ghana a month before that. At two different Bitcoin conferences that were focused around community adoption of Bitcoin. So really people on the ground doing the hard work of educating people, of explaining to people this isn't a scam, here's how to technically use it, etc. And at these events, there's just this deep sense of optimism. And I think that optimism comes from people. This maybe sounds like a little too cheesy to say, but people who essentially believe in like human ambition, the human spirit, people coming together to make change, people coming together to say like, we want to make change. And what I was actually sort of most taken back by at LibertyCon, I would say, and just quick context, when people in the United States see something called like LibertyCon or blah, 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 I would imagine most people think there's like people walking around with like sawed-off shotguns yelling about how much they love the Second Amendment and this and that, and not a lot of sort of like intellectual conversation going on. And I don't say that as any sort of offense to anyone who loves sawed-off shotguns and guns. Like that's not the point. But what was amazing was that people spoke about things with great nuance. They were talking about concepts of freedom. People were highly critical of people like Donald Trump, people who have authoritarian tendencies. So it wasn't, when people hear freedom and liberty, it often gets associated with like the far right or people on the right or whatever it is. It's not necessarily that. It is an idea that, as you said, the world, generally speaking, it's the exception, not the rule, to not live under an authoritarian government. The majority of the world lives under an authoritarian regime. There's more of that happening. And as populism rises and people become more desperate and economic situations around the world become more dire, people gravitate towards that. They want someone above them to come up with answers for them because it's harder for them to find answers on their own. But it's at these conferences, whether it's a Bitcoin conference or a conference on classical liberalism, you have people saying, yeah, we're in a tough situation, but we are optimistic. We do want to come together and discuss what some potential ways forward are. And more than anything, I think what was amazing about both of these conferences, all three of these conferences, was how diverse they were. You have people from all over the world talking about their situation, talking about applying certain principles in their context. And that's really, really important. Instead of a top-down think tank or something saying, here's how to do this. It's like, no, let's hear from people on the ground. What are they doing? How are they making things better? And how are they empowering people in their communities? So I want to say thank you again for both coming on the podcast, for having me down at the conference. But before we part ways, please let people know where they can find you, where they could find Alumni for Liberty, Students for Liberty, all this kind of stuff, where they could follow online.
Excellent, of course. Basically, they can find me in all social media. Just my last name and my name, Jraissati Jorge,
Cool.
which, in case that people are wondering, is Lebanese origin, and that's why it's a bit difficult to spell. But basically, you can find me there. You can find us at AF Liberty in like all social media as well, and you can also find my email somewhere on the internet. Any questions that you guys have, just send me an email, send me a private message on social media, and the more people that want to contribute, the better. We need everybody. We need people from like different circumstances, experiences, from activists to academics, to people that want to support financially. We need everybody to come together to create a true coalition for change. And I believe in this. Journalists, of course, people who give us platform is excellent because, as you mentioned, for example, most people don't know the situation happens. As you mentioned, by the way, freedom is like oxygen. Like we have it, you and I right now, but and we don't feel it. But when you are not free, then you really, really feel it. So when you don't have a bank account, so when you don't have economic freedoms, or when you have, in the case of Venezuela, you have public officials telling businesses how to be run and telling people how they should vote, or telling journalists what they should write about, or telling young people what ideas they should pursue or follow, then you start not breathing. When you are fighting, we're fighting to breathe. So I want to thank you for all that you do. It was great to connect with you, and I'm sure we'll do many, many interesting things together.
Yeah, I could feel it in my gut that will be the case. So yes, thank you again. Thank you to everybody listening, and we will be in touch. We'll talk soon. All right, take it easy, everybody.
Bye-bye.